Deputy Owen Murphy.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Professor. We know from the pre-crisis period that there was extraordinary access on the parts of the banks to senior political figures. I mean, when we look at those contexts, does access necessarily mean influence in policy decision-making? And a second question to that is, are we talking then, if we think it does, about limiting access or just monitoring it?
Access may or may not involve influence, and influence may or may not be appropriate. There's no general answer to that. One thing to remember is that people who want government to do something like to have access, and access is not evenly distributed amongst different groups and interests in our society. So having exceptionally easy access could be a problem in a context where we're trying to think about the balance of consultation and the balance of interest that gain access. That's really the concern there.
So, I mean, would good design mean then limiting access or just monitoring it more effectively?
Well, I think our recent moves now to have a register of lobbyists is very helpful in that regard. And again, it's part of tightening up on our rule-based monitoring and on trying to introduce more sort of oversight and regulation of how interests gain voice in political access, in political representations. That's very helpful. But my point, I think, that I keep coming back to is that by itself that's never enough. And what we also need is to be thinking about the way in which we might open out deliberation about policy and expose the kind of engagements that governments have with different kind of interests to scrutiny, to inspection. So it's partly a sort of government in the sunlight. Whenever something is secret, we may want to know why. Is there something we really should know about here?
Just sticking up with the lobbying bill just for a moment, I mean, do you think it's important that where an informal contact is made, that there be a requirement that be noted and that be published? Because coming back to this idea of a small society and people bumping into people knowing each other, meeting someone at a golf course, for example, and something getting raised in that context.
The problem is in a small society where you stop. Where you stop. I bumped into Michael Noonan in Charles de Gaulle Airport one time, just accidentally. Do I report that? Where do you stop? It's trying to pin down every single instance of contact in rules and trying to enforce reporting and everything is the high road to disaster, really, in terms of monitoring and just respect for the rules. That's probably not the way to go. But there may be ways of requiring more vigorous compliance with engagements, structured and unstructured engagements that I don't know about. I'm not in a position to comment on how lobbying legislation is to be implemented.
When it comes to this idea of creating an environment for the competition of ideas, and you mentioned earlier, for example, the Fiscal Advisory Council, I mean, is that an example of how you create that environment, or is that, could that be seen as an example of creating another agency or a voice that may or may not be listened to?
I think it's most of all about developing a culture. Now, how you develop a culture is a challenge. So I have some specific thoughts about ways in which these sorts of priorities can be supported, including, I suggested, involving universities and other people who have expertise in particular kinds of policy areas in policy debates. There are innovations inside some government departments at the moment. For example, the Department of the Taoiseach has been organising open seminars on key issues, on risk assessment, for example. The Department of Public Expenditure and Reform has been very involved in reaching out to and engaging with lots of different areas of expertise, as well as building up the Irish Government and Economic Evaluation Service. And we in UCD, if I can do a small institutional plug here, we're quite keen in thinking about ways in which we can develop these sort of academic practitioner engagements. Recently I organised a roundtable involving people from the public service. There were about 20 or 30 people there, people from the Department of Finance and PER and academics, and we had a very good discussion about international trends in public sector reform, which is, I think, is helpful and informative for all concerned. I think those sorts of practices can only be a good thing.
Thank you, Chair. Just then coming back to this idea of institutional design, and we look back to the pre-crisis years, do you think that the Oireachtas was designed in a way that it could effectively oversee government action? Or was it a question of it maybe coming down to the way it was used, the practice in the Parliament at the time?
Well, we have a fully functional, fully constitutional, fully democratic political system with a constitution that says that the executive is accountable to the legislature. So in formal and in constitutional terms, we're right up there. There's nothing wrong with our formal democratic structures. I think giving them effect is what I'm talking about. We have a very typical Westminster-type parliamentary system. And because the government is fully formed from the legislature, it means that the practice of party discipline to control majorities in the legislature does mean that there is sort of preferential access to use of power to get legislation through, to curtail debate and so on if the government wants to do it. That's built into Westminster systems. That's how they work. We're very like the British Parliament in that regard. But I think that the British Parliament itself has changed in some of its practices. In Ireland, you know, we've been developing parliamentary committees since the 1980s. But in Britain, they have gone further. I think House of Commons committees are, frankly, scary for the people who have to appear before them. Their reports are debated in Parliament. They get a lot of public attention. So I would actually like to see a situation where parliamentary committee reports, where Oireachtas reports, and there are many excellent reports, really featured as the agenda item in public debates, and where the substance then of the kind of policy learning that happens through having, you know, vigorous debates in the Oireachtas that would then push, you know, issues through to maybe a legislative agenda, but it would certainly help to create the kind of environment and the kind of expectations that I've been talking about for a normative reappraisal of the way we do our business. So very often when we're doing business as usual, it's hard to see outside the parameters.
Up there, doesn't it bring another questioner?